So we have now scheduled a few guest lecturers, each of them notable experts in their field. And we're beginning with George Moore, backed by popular demand. George has lectured in this class several times. And for those of you who are in nuclear engineering, I think you'd be particularly interested in his background to see what does someone with a PhD in nuclear engineering do in life. So George has multiple titles at the moment. He's a scientist in residence at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies of the Middlebury Institute of International Studies, and is a technical fellow in the Monterey Cybersecurity Institute. He teaches courses and workshops in nuclear trafficking, nuclear forensics, cybersecurity, drones and surveillance, and other legal and technical topics such as weapons testing, the CTBT, and nuclear security. George is a former Fulbright scholar. He received his PhD in nuclear engineering and his law degree from UC Berkeley. He's a member of the California and Colorado Boards of Professional Engineering California. For 5 years, from 2007 to 2012, he was a senior analyst in the IAEA's Office of Nuclear Security, working with the IAEA's Nuclear Trafficking Group, and with the development of top-level documents in the IAEA's Nuclear Security Series. He was also scientific secretary for the Director General's Advisory Committee on Nuclear Security. And prior to that, he worked formally on the National Laboratory staff at Lawrence Livermore Lab, where he had assignments in nuclear physics, nuclear effects, radiation detection and measurement, nuclear threat analysis, and emergency field operations. And he's also a former licensed research reactor operator. So he's kind of a busy fellow. He really is almost a unique figure in our field because of his knowledge of so many different areas, and in particular, placing the whole issue of IAEA safeguards in a broader context. He's going to speak on the nexus of technology and policy, the IAEA, the NPT, and nuclear safeguards. So please welcome George.
Thank you for that nice introduction. I think what that means is, you know, if you survive and you live for a long time, you get to do a lot of different things. But I did kind of grow up over here in Echeverry, and the research reactor, which we used to have, was the one I operated. That was under the new hall here. So things change. But one constant that you'll find is that things change. So what we're going to talk about is the IAEA, NPT, and safeguards. And there are a couple of themes that I want you to pick up on. A lot of people think that safeguards is directly tied to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is, but it actually precedes the NPT. We'll talk about that. Interestingly enough, let me ask a question. Did any of you see a flyer about a safeguards course in Monterey at the beginning of June? Tuition free, go on down. I see one or two people nodding. Because I didn't get any applications from Berkeley. So if you're going to be here next year, apply. It's a good summer course to come down. You get to spend a week in Monterey. We'll give you a small stipend. It's enough to find a place to stay and maybe eat, as long as you eat hot. So we'll talk about the history. We'll talk about, there are a number of these safeguards regimes, and oops, I'm also trying not to mess up here. These safeguard regimes depend on the individual state, and you'll find that even some countries which are not NPT signatories have safeguards for some of their facilities. So keep that in mind. Safeguards is a system of accounting and control to ensure that nuclear materials are not used for making nuclear weapons. Now, that doesn't mean they can't be used, those materials can't be used for military purposes. We'll talk about that maybe as a little side effect, as a loophole to the NPT. It's really not a loophole, but that's what some people So what is the IAEA? It's easier for me to point over here than it is to point here, so I'll point over here. What is the IAEA? It is not a subsidiary of the UN. It is a separate international organization. It has a different membership than the UN totally. It has its own Director General. Its Director General reports to the Security Council. It does not report to the General Assembly. So these are some important differences. Currently, the DG is Yuki Amano from Japan. One of the interesting things is that he spent a year at Monterey as a visiting diplomat. So we have a close relationship, or that's a very broad we. I have little relationship with him at all. I mean, I think he recognized me because I used to come to meetings that I was the secretary for. But he and our director, Bill Potter, who Michael knows quite well, I think, and other people in the business know, are close friends, and he gets Director Amano to come to events, which sometimes have a crowd that's about a third the size of what we've got in this room, which is a little surprising because the DG normally doesn't do that. So let's talk a bit about the structure. Under the IAEA, and we'll talk about the history of how it was formed, but the structure is that under the Director General, there are Deputy Director Generals which break down organizationally. There are three major components, well, four actually. Safeguards is the big 800-pound gorilla. They are the biggest, both budgetary-wise, physical, space-wise, personnel-wise, any way you want to parse it, they are the biggest portion of the IAEA. The second biggest portion is one that you may not have ever heard of. It's called technical cooperation. And technical cooperation is that portion of the IAEA that is part of the quid pro quo for the NPT. This is where they put out training on peaceful uses of nuclear and radioactive material. So technical cooperation will send people to various countries. Yeah, this is maybe a little too much information, but one of the things I'm really proud of when I was at the IAEA is that I feel that I was able to save some cattle in Nepal. Okay, now how does that even come about? Running a training operation in Sri Lanka, Nepal, which was then not an IAEA member, sent some representatives. The representatives wanted to talk about how radiation sickness was damaging some cattle in a remote location in Nepal that you can only get into about 6 months of the year. And as evidence of that, they brought pictures of the sick cows lying on the ground with a radiation detection instrument on their back, and the well cows standing up with a radiation instrument on their back, and the readings were different. The cows on the ground had higher radiation readings, so they obviously had radiation sickness. For those of you who are nuclear engineers, hopefully you understand that the radiation is background radiation coming from the ground, and when you're closer to the ground, you're going to get a higher reading. These people did not understand this. Technical cooperation, to my surprise, had their own veterinarians. I was able to get technical cooperation veterinarians and people from UC Davis to deal with the people in Nepal, find out that this was a dietary deficiency, and actually save some of the cows. So it's a long story, but you'll be surprised at what you get into. And just because you're a nuclear engineer doesn't mean that you don't sometimes deal with veterinary science and weird things that happen. So you've got safeguards, you've got technical cooperation, then you have safety and security and nuclear engineering. Then you have a couple of other minor things, like there's a Deputy Director General for kind of administration, which handles human resources and that sort of thing. I was in the safety and security. Security is the new kid on the block, basically post 9/11. And in fact, there's been a conflict historically between safety and security at the IAEA. The safety people, it's a little bit of a turf battle. The safety people said, there's no such thing as nuclear security. I mean, look at the statute of the IAEA. There is nothing in the statute of the IAEA which says a word about security. Security is a state responsibility, none of our business. Turns out that view, unfortunately, has not prevailed because it's an important thing in the modern day to have good nuclear security programs. And we'll talk about some of those as we go along. But you still see some vestiges of this argument about the fact that there there is really no nuclear security, and it's not an appropriate act for the IAEA. So under the DDGs, you have departments, various departments break down. When you get down to the work reviews. Okay, so IAEA responds basically to this problem. After World War II, we're the only people with atomic weapons. There's a question around the world. Everybody else is afraid of the United States because we have these atomic weapons. We're not quite sure what we're going to do about it. The United Nations was formed. Where was the United Nations formed?
San Francisco.
That doesn't count when you guys answer. It's for the students to answer. San Francisco, right across the bay, the Opera House in San Francisco. So, and this is done during the war. So obviously, not all the players who are still in the UN now are part of the original court, origin. Well, one of the issues that they're worried about is how can you control nuclear weapons? They formed the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission, the UN AEC. In the old days in the United States, we had the US Atomic Energy Commission. Everybody had atomic energy. I don't know. Maybe the Russians had it. They called it the AEC. I don't know. I don't speak Russian. But anyway, UN AEC. UN AEC didn't last very long. It could never get anything done. But it was formed by the first resolution of the UN General Assembly. And the idea was this was going to be the thing that really the nations cooperated with, we cooperated with. There were even proposals, and we'll see one, you had the Baruch plan, you had Lilienthal, you had people like that. There was some consideration that we would turn over control of nuclear weapons to the UN. Imagine Ban Ki-moon or somebody like that in control of nuclear weapons. Maybe not as scary as the current administration, but who knows? But really, this UN AEC was ineffective after 1949 because the Russians tested in 49. The Russians did everything they could. The Soviet Union did everything they could to block the UN AEC from doing anything. And it was set up more or less on the same line as the Security Council, where people could veto things. At least the permanent members could veto things. So let's. It is important too because the terms of reference, the guiding principles of the UN AEC, that's where you get the first mention of safeguards. And if you read down here, control of atomic energy, blah, 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 elimination, blah, 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 for effective safeguards by way of inspection and other means to protect compliant states against the hazards and violations of agents. This is going back 60 years, 70 years. So safeguards was an original idea. It's not something that came along after the NPT where they said, oh, we got the NPT, so we ought to have some way of protecting. This is what we've talked about. We talked about the Baruch plan based on the actions of the Lilienthal report. So if you're a historian, these are interesting things to look at, but we required that there be a veto-proof UN controls that would ensure peaceful use only. How could you peacefully use a nuclear weapon? Well, we had a very big program in the United States. If you Google, I always encourage my students to bring their laptops to class. It's good for shopping for shoes, plus sometimes looking for things that the professor brings up. If you Google an aerial view of the Nevada test site, you'll see one big hole around it. It's called Sedan crater. The Sedan crater was a result of a peaceful nuclear explosives test to determine whether we could do sufficient cratering to build a second Panama Canal using peaceful, or what we call P&Es. By the way, how many states in the United States have had a nuclear weapon detonated in that state? Somebody's counting on their fingers. That's always a good sign. Fellow with a t-shirt is counting on his fingers. How many?
Nevada, Alaska, Colorado, I think one in Arkansas.
No, but you're close. Mississippi. That's the one people usually don't get. You can make the argument that there's been at least 6. Hattiesburg, Mississippi, if you look it up, This was a P&E gas-freeing test. Gas-freeing is fracking with nuclear weapons. That's what was done in Colorado, at Farmington, Colorado. So, you know, there were all sorts of plans to peacefully use nuclear explosives. It's not as crazy as it sounds. What would be a P&E use right now, and in fact, it's been in the news in the last month, for using nuclear explosives other than to kill people and blow up cities and command bunkers, you know, disrupt the North Korean nuclear weapons program? Yes?
Ask for a reflection.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a fellow at Livermore who's an expert in astrophysicist, who's an expert in this area. Dearborn, his name is Dan Dearborn. Dave Dearborn. So this is a proposal. What do you do if the astronomers call and say, oh, by the way, there's a big one coming right at us? It's going to be like the thing in the Yucatan. You know, we saw on Saturday Night Live this last Saturday, you know, saw the John Goodman invitation of, you know, Rex Tillerson, you know, T-Rex, Jurassic Park, the whole thing. Well, you know, dinosaurs went away after the big meteor hit the Yucatan. What do you do? But what's the problem with using P&Es right now to do anything? At least two I can think of. One is the Outer Space Treaty, no weapons in outer space. Another one is the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. No explosions whatsoever, including P&Es. So, a lot of things that, you know, you ought to read the history of just to become familiar with. Well, okay. So, between the UN AEC, you get to the IAEA. Shortly after that, you've got the Atoms for Peace speech. This is Eisenhower giving a speech to the United Nations where he talks about evils, potential evils of the military-industrial complex. That's not the same speech, I'm sorry. It's a mistake. Gives the Atoms for Peace speech. IAEA gets created in 1957. Headquartered in Vienna. In the old days, it was down in the ring in an old hotel. It kind of grew and morphed. Kurt Waldheim got at a facility across the Danube at Kaisermullen, a nice big complex. Unfortunately, Waldheim was found to have a Nazi past, and although there's a picture of him, it's not a very good picture in the building. Well, so you get the IAEA in 57. France goes nuclear in 60. China goes nuclear in 64. People are getting really upset about atmospheric testing. Not the subject of this discussion, but there are a lot of things that go on. And you get negotiation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 65-68 goes into effect in 1970. So what does that bring about? Well, one of the things that it brings about is Article 3, the statute of the IAEA. If you haven't read it, it's not that long to read. Read it sometime. Article 3 authorizes the establishment of safeguards as applied at the request of parties to an international instrument or at the request of a state. Why would a state request safeguard inspectors to come to their state and look at things? People did. Yeah, we had it.
Yeah, so like you get a new election in Iran, the president wants to stay compliant.
That's true. Iran's getting inspected a lot now, but yes, that's a potential thing. Well, I had skipped over this, but I think we mentioned it. The UN AEC, it's arguably a replacement. The IAEA is arguably a replacement for the UN AEC, and it reports to the Security Council. So when you work there, you carry a UN laissez-passe if you're a high enough level. You're treated as if you're a UN civil servant, but in reality, you're not. You're an employee of this independent agency. So Article 12 sets up safeguards program with staff and inspectors. And in the beginning, there were only a few inspectors. Inspectors come from all different countries. I got an email literally this morning from a woman who is a Colombian. She's a dual citizen, Colombian and US, and also Latvian, which is a little, she's tri-national, which is a little bit unusual. And she just got accepted as a safeguards inspector. She has a master's in nuclear security from the Midlands Universities in the UK. But she's been working with us for the last couple of years at the Czech Technical University in Prague on a seminar that we do during January. So these people come from all over. They're usually junior people. They start out about your age for most of you. Some of you look a little older, but you know, some of you it's about your age, mid-20s, late 20s. Rare to see an inspector start out in their mid-30s or beyond. Not unheard of, but not very normal. So the IAEA, the way they do business is they put out documents called information circulars. So it sounds like what you find on the telephone poles around here that somebody lost their dog, right? An information circular. Except that's the way they do business, and that's the way they lay out their big programs. INSERC 26 in 1961, which dealt with test reactors, research reactors, and power reactors less than 100 megawatts thermal, which there are hardly any. And INSERC 66 in 1967 established pre-NPT safeguards. And those safeguards are still in effect in countries which are not members of the NPT, but are members of IAEA. For example, India, Pakistan, Israel. They have safeguards on some of their facilities. These are declared facilities containing nuclear material. So it's important to understand this. You have these pre-NPT safeguards. Once you get to the NPT, it changes a bit. But pre-NPT safeguards rely on states to declare the facilities. In other words, a pre-NPT state has to say, we have a facility here. They're supposed to declare it a year before, maybe 6 months before, I don't remember the time exactly. We have a facility in which we're going to have nuclear material. What's nuclear material? We've been talking about it. What have I been talking about? What is nuclear material? You may venture a guess. If they're trying to protect, yes.
So you're going to have like uranium-235 or something, 239, like.
Yeah, actually, the chapter 20, big Roman 2 X's, or like you can remember it's Dos Equis beer, has the definition, not of nuclear material. There are two terms that the IAEA uses, which are source material and special fissionable material. Taken together, that meets most people's definition of nuclear material. The various instruments, for example, the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material, or INSERC 225 revision 5, have different definitions. So you have to see what it is that people are really talking about. And basically, anything containing plutonium, anything that contains uranium-235 is special fissionable material. And then source material also includes things like thorium. Most of you understand the thorium fuel cycle. A lot of my students think that thorium is a fuel. We have to go through a lot of explanation that thorium itself is not a fuel. It is used to breed, that's a bad term to use, but it's one that people understand. From thorium, you get uranium-233. You also get some uranium-232. So you have to have these declared facilities. And this is a big problem. This is a problem which we'll see develop later with the development of the model additional protocol and more broadened efforts by the IAEA to make declarations as far as a state and to look at the state as a whole. Not just what the state says is there, but to examine the whole of the state. The idea being to prevent the state from diverting material into nuclear weapons. Okay, that's for the non-nuclear weapon states. Okay. The NPT went into effect in 1970, accepts safeguards on all material per Article 3. INSERC 153, this is what is called comprehensive safeguards. It sets up the initial relationship for safeguards with all the non-nuclear weapon states and with the nuclear weapon states if they choose to participate. It is a system which was subject to some abuse. When this system went into effect, it involves an individual agreement between each state and the IAEA. There's actually a document, an agreement document between each state and the IAEA. There are provisions in those documents for confidentiality. If you work at the IAEA and you don't work in safeguards, you have no access whatsoever to safeguards information. Safeguards has its own classification scheme, which is much like the US classification scheme. There's safeguards confidential, safeguards secret, safeguards top secret. I don't think they go beyond that. I've only seen stuff up to secret. But you have this source of special fissionable material, IAEA Statute 20. This causes problems because in our program here in the United States, we talk about special nuclear material, S&M. And there are weird definitions floating around about S&M. S&M, in some definitions by some agencies, includes byproduct material. And byproduct material, when you read the definition of that, that's what you have as the residue of fission. In other words, fission fragments. That's byproduct material. Well, that's not what most people think of as nuclear material. Most people think of nuclear material as being the stuff from which you can make nuclear weapons. But this stuff doesn't contain things like neptunium or americium, things that can make critical mass. There's about a dozen different radionuclides from which you can develop a critical mass. And if you can develop a critical mass, if you're clever enough, have enough time, and are stupid enough, you can come up with some sort of weapon. But it doesn't cover those, it just covers the stuff that people thought about back when they were doing this back in the 60s. Plutonium, basically high enriched uranium, stuff with the U-235 above a certain level. And actually, when I was talking about special fissionable material, for material containing U-235, this is anything that's enriched. Doesn't deal with natural level. Natural and depleted stuff is in the source category. Doesn't mean it's not safeguarded. It just means it's in a different category. So elements of MCERT 153 are information and access. What happens is the state makes a declaration, and then the IAEA attempts to verify. So what happens if a state doesn't declare everything that they have? Too bad. Unless the IAEA stumbles across it, they're not going to find it under 153. Okay? Because they don't have the power to go in and just inspect everywhere and tear things up. What has happened more recently at the IAEA, but more recently in the last 15 to 20 years, is through cooperation from member states, they have developed the ability to do things like use commercial satellite photography and things like that to look at things that they find suspicious. You also have to understand where the fuel cycle is covered by safeguards, because the beginning of the fuel cycle, mining and milling, is not covered. It's not until you get to a fairly processed form of uranium ore where you've actually extracted the uranium. You get to UF6 and you start tracking it with safeguards, kind of counting for it. Because before that, it's just almost an impossible task. You know, somebody's got 100 drums, 55-gallon drums of yellow cake. Unless it's being shipped out of the country, there's no effort by safeguards to track it. So the way this works is that you have states making this initial declaration, and it gets verified by inspection. So an important point for you to understand in the whole IAEA system is this term called significant quantity. And a significant quantity is defined for uranium-233, 235, I'm going to show a graphic at the end of this, show some of this. It's basically an amount that will establish a weapons program. Many people get confused by this, and they think it's the minimum amount to make a nuclear weapon. It is not. And it's a common failing of people who write about these topics to equate those two things, an SQ and the minimum amount to build a nuclear weapon. You could get a big surprise by doing that if someone builds a weapon with less than an SQ. The SQ is established because the goal of the inspection program in safeguards is not to prevent, but to detect the diversion of an SQ between inspection cycles. So if you can produce more than an SQ during the inspection cycle is too long. You've got to get the inspection cycle down where you can detect an SQ. So what happens is then the SQ becomes a political football. If we were to cut the SQ, which is now, for example, 8 kilograms of plutonium, down to what DOE has said is the minimum amount to build a nuclear weapon, 4 kilograms, by the DOE definition, that would mean the SQ would drop by 1/2. It would mean inspections would have to be twice as often, and that would drive the IAEA nuts, because the IAEA is not funded at a very high level of funding. And they just don't have the people. They barely have the people to do inspections as it is. The non-nuclear weapon states, which are considered to be more problematic, places like Iran, complain bitterly, continuously, that they are being singled out, and that we really should be, spending more of our time inspecting the evil Canadians, because they're obviously the people who are diverting stuff to a clandestine nuclear weapons program. That was a joke. I mean, that's okay. Okay. All right. So let's go on. Well, let's go back. This point here is really important. Safeguards is a detection system. It is not a deterrent system, other than the fact, just like crime, if you can detect it, that may deter some people from doing it because they don't want it to be detected. But it is not a system which concentrates on security. Inspectors come in, it's an accounting process. If they want to see this cup full of something, it's in their system, they want to see the cup. They don't care if the cup is here, down the street, or down on Telegram, as long as everybody knows where it is. They're not concerned with the security. Now, they don't just totally ignore security. They'll come back to the agency and say, wow, these people had no security. But there are instances where they do their inspection, say, well, everything is fine from us inspection-wise, but it would really be nice if they had some guards around this facility, or some locks on the doors, or things like that, because there's nothing to keep people from coming in and stealing. Okay, so going on, these are other things that are tied to the whole safeguard system, but not directly. The Zanger Committee, Nuclear Safeguards, Nuclear Suppliers Group, all of these tie back to safeguards, because usually these systems, for example, in Nuclear Suppliers Group, for certain things, they have agreements that they will not supply materials to a country which does not have comprehensive safeguards. The US-India agreement, from about 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, I can't remember the date exactly, it went totally around this whole thing. And if you talk to Potter, our director, he will say the US-India agreement did more to undermine the NPT than any other act done in the last 20 years. Because we essentially said, hey, you don't have to join the NPT, we'll give you the benefits. Well, Pakistan wasn't too thrilled with that, other countries. And if you're worried about the NPT, then you worry about such things. We just mentioned, the US has what are called 1, 2, 3 agreements. This comes from a section of the code that establishes these. These are bilateral agreements with various states for which we supply nuclear material, for example, reactor fuel, things like that. All of these 1, 2, 3 agreements require not only safeguards, but we also require that the states comply with Insert 225 revision, whatever it was when they negotiated, which is a security document. So when we supply things, when we, the United States, supply them, we say, you don't get these unless we can ensure ourselves that you have adequate security. That is not true in general. Okay, just the United States does that. I don't know what other suppliers do. There's also what's called the small quantities protocol. Why should you go through all the mechanisms of safeguards if you only have 10 grams of highly enriched uranium? So there's a small quantities protocol. This covers about 2/3 of the states that have any kind of security. So you don't have to do very much. You just have to make an annual declaration, and you still have it. So what happened was, along the way, we started finding out that all these people, even though they were non-nuclear weapon states, which had agreed to and had safeguards inspectors going to facilities, they're actually running clandestine weapons programs. Okay? So That was a tough thing for Hans Blix and so the people could really accept that these people could really be duplicitous. Okay. I don't know. They had a different view. So consideration was insert 153, probably not enough. This led to insert 540, which is the model additional protocol. This is kind of the gold standard for agreements associated with the NPT, but it's voluntary. The NPT itself mandates that you execute an agreement with the IAEA to implement insert 153 safeguards. 540, you have to agree to. And many states do, because it's not a big deal. It's not that big a deal. I mean, if you're not running a clandestine weapons program, why not agree to it? Expands the information state must provide, well, there's a little bit of overhead there. Allows for inspection of the total fuel cycle, okay, which is not part of the original agreement. Allows for short notice inspection, and this is kind of arguable because you can make short notice inspections under 153. It's just not as broad as 540. And when this came about, after a while, some of the states said, hey, wait a minute. This is a power grab by the IAEA. You're adding a whole bunch of things that you couldn't do, like these short notice inspections. And then people said, no, wait a minute, I'm 153, we can do short notice inspections. It's just we don't do very many of them because there's no reason to generally. Allows for environmental sampling. That's a big deal. You know, when the systems burp, and particularly if they burp with the CTBTO monitoring, we can talk about that if you want to. The International Monitoring System of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organization is very responsive to any leakage from either weapons tests or from reactors, and sometimes they confuse the two, not intentionally, but they can be confusing, seismic, etc. Whole bunch of stuff. But the big thing about 540 begins to focus on the state level as opposed to facility level. So there is a finding now made once a year by the DG of the IAEA to the Security Council that, you know, for this state or that state, we have sufficient information that we can certify with the best of our knowledge. They're not doing anything that's not allowed under the NPT. That's not an accurate statement of what it is, but that's genesis or summary of what it is. But there are some states for which they can't do that. They say, we don't have sufficient information at this point in time to do that. But you can read that every year. Our safeguards implemented, well, you have inspections. Big thing with tamper-resistant seals. They seal up material. Let's say you have new fuel that's not going to be put in, or highly enriched reactor system, which hopefully we'll get rid of most of those. But there are some out there. So that's material that could be used directly with very little processing in a nuclear weapon. So that material has tamper-resistant seals put on, so that the inspectors can come back and say, nobody touched that material, nobody diverted that material. They do a lot of non-destructive assay. For example, they'll look at spent fuel from a power reactor in the pool. They'll put things down in the pool, look at it, to make sure nobody is taking spent fuel rods out and processing them to extract plutonium. They do real-time monitoring, sometimes video monitoring, where things are linked back to be in it. Cameras that record things, real-time monitoring of power levels, etc. And they have, as I mentioned earlier, some intelligence-like activities. They monitor open source information about commercial transactions involving things that might be useful for a nuclear weapons program, dual use items, things like that. And they look at overhead satellite imagery. And member states can contribute intelligence information. Of course, when you contribute the intelligence information, you lose the classification. And it goes into the IAEA system, and the IAEA system leaks like a sieve. So you know, people do that at their danger. So contributions of safeguards to non-proliferation doesn't prevent, but it sure slowed it down. There were estimates that before the NPT, within a 10 or 20 year period, there would be an additional 20 to 30 nuclear weapon states. We have a few that have come online since the NPT, but not very many. Loopholes, mentioned that earlier on. It's a really new thing, this pointer. So you can use material in military programs, for example, in nuclear power submarines. And the Iranians have been making noises that they need to do exactly that recently. Post the JCPOA, this is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action for the agreement that Trump seems to be considering getting rid of. And I think it's kind of dangerous for the Iranians to keep messing around with this and throwing this out because, number one, they don't have the infrastructure to build that sort of thing on their own. But throwing this out is like throwing matches at gasoline because it may ignite something within our administration that says, enough of this, we're going to shut you down permanently. We're not going to go with this. So the NPT and the safeguard system only deal with states. There's nothing about non-state actors. There's a general responsibility for states for non-state actors within their borders, but that's kind of international law stuff. It's not related to this. And it doesn't cover all weapons materials. So things like neptunium, that sort of thing, they're not totally covered by this. But the implication is that, you know, if anybody really started to develop something, they probably would. There is a discussion of these as alternative nuclear materials. Which would be that. Okay, safeguards isn't safety, and it isn't security, both of which are separate aspects of IAEA programs. Safeguards is mandatory, safety and security aren't. The IAEA is not a regulatory body like the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. If the Nuclear Regulatory Commission says, Diablo Canyon, you will do this, or you lose your operator's license, and we'll shut you down, and we'll send the US Marshals or whoever in to shut you down, they can do that. The IAEA can only stand by and say, Fukushima, maybe we can help you with that, but they're not the regulator. They don't do design reviews, they don't do things like that. They provide assistance only. The only thing that's mandatory is in the safeguards by the agreement under the NPT. There's one kind of exception to that. If a state does not conform to IAEA nuclear safety, not security, but safety standards, it's not supposed to get technical cooperation assistance. But that is honored more in the breach than in reality. We talked about this already, that safeguards has its own classification. Safeguards also doesn't deal with other radioactive materials. So the stuff that's involved with an RDD, a dirty bomb, which is a subset of an RDD, all those other things that people worry about, simple explosion bars, etc. Safeguards has nothing to do with that. Safeguards only deals with nuclear material, the things that they define as nuclear material. There is an IAEA code of conduct for radioactive sources that deals with some things, but you have to be very careful to read it. First of all, it's not mandatory. States will say, and a lot of states in response to the Nuclear Security Summit, what they said is, we swear on a stack of Bibles that we are conform to the code of conduct for radioactive sources. Okay, well, that's nice, and that's maybe helpful. But this only covers a subset of radioactive materials. It only covers seal sources. So if my coffee cup is full of liquid radioactive material, and the top, and this is not sealed, like my coffee is not sealed, it's not covered. Okay. It also doesn't only cover certain categories of radioactive sources. And by categories, this is what I'm talking about. This is the IAEA categorization table for radioactive materials, not nuclear materials, radioactive materials. Arabic numbers, categories 1 through 5. Ones are the most dangerous. These are the big things, food radiators, things like that. It's based on a D value, which is a value for each type of each radionuclide. The agency has developed a D value. For cobalt-60, for example, it's a curie, or it's 3.7 times 3.7 gigabecquerels, which is, they put it out in both. So if you have 100 curies of cobalt-60, you divide that by the D value, which is 1. I picked this skillfully because it's mathematics simple. 100 divided by 1 is 100. So you would go into this table, and that would be a category 2 source. So this is the way this is done. This all comes out of an IAEA publication called RSG 1.9, which you can get all the IAEA publications with very few exceptions. You can download a PDF form from the agency. So that's the way they deal with radioactive material. For nuclear material, they have a categorization table that comes out of insert 225. The current revision is 5. It depends on the material type. This is hard to read. This is plutonium, uranium-235, uranium-233, and it breaks down into 3 categories, and these are Roman numerals, so you have to be careful. Fortunately, they go in the same way. The category 1s are the most dangerous. So category 1, plutonium, unirradiated, we're talking 2 kilograms or more. If you read the footnote, it says it has to be plutonium, which is not plutonium, where the 238 content, plutonium-238 content is greater than 80%. Now, why would you exempt plutonium with a plutonium-238 content greater than 80%? Because if you understand plutonium, that plutonium-238, you have a critical mass, it has a big cross-section, it's not something that interferes with weapons if it's along for the ride, because its cross-section is quite comparable to the other plutoniums. Why would you exempt that? Any ideas? We use a lot of plutonium-238. If you look at the Apollo missions to the moon, if you look at deep space missions, where they get far enough from the sun, where the old solar panels don't work, you got to have an RTG on board. Our RTGs are fueled with plutonium-238. So the big 800-pound gorilla in negotiations, being the United States, said, we want an exemption for that. We're not going to agree to this if you don't exempt this. So it's a political exemption. Remember, we're talking about the nexus of technology and policy. It's a political exemption. It's not one. The other thing is, plutonium-238 has such a high decay rate, alpha decay rate, that it generates so much heat that anybody who tried to build a nuclear weapon with a lot of it in it would have to build a nuclear weapon in some sort of deep freeze or cool to liquid nitrogen temperatures or something weird like that, that it's basically useless for nuclear weapons. But it's still a political exemption. Now, if you were able to read C here, footnote C, when you get to less than category 3, it says quantities not falling in category 3 in natural uranium, depleted uranium, and thorium should be protected at least in accordance with prudent management practice. That sounds great. Anybody know what prudent management practice is? Not defined in the document whatsoever. So I guess it's whatever you want to do with it. If you want to throw it down the stairs, that's prudent management practice in your country. But if you were to read this, this comes out of insert 225. The current document was just finally got ratified by enough people to put it in effect, and the U.S. was almost the last kid on the block, is a Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material. Exactly the same table here, except that thorium is deleted. There's no thorium in footnote C of the CPP now. The reason being that big 800-pound gorilla there is India, which wants to have a thorium fuel cycle because they have lots of thorium. In fact, there's lots of thorium in the world. It's 5 times or 10 times as much thorium as there is uranium. There's a lot of uranium too. So we're not too worried about this whole thing. So I think I have one more graphic, but you'll have, I'm leaving this presentation for you, so if you don't want to look up the references, you can at least look at PowerPoint. Last thing, the ironic, JCPOA. Who inspects? Well, when they made the JCPOA, it was like, hey, IAEA will do this stuff. Where does the IAEA have confidence in inspecting centrifuges? Where do they get it from? One of the things that's little known about this whole system is that any country can reject any inspector. So a US inspector, a British inspector, or a French inspector is not going to get near Iran. The Iranians have a right to reject them, and they do routinely. So basically, they reject anybody who comes from a nuclear weapons state who has a technical competence to do inspection. Maybe not the best system, but it is the system that we have. So, where does that leave us? Well, that leaves us at the end here. Final point, that significant quantity thing. I like, if any day I can learn one thing, I always think that's a real bonus. You know, so if you learn only one thing, come away from this lecture, come away with the idea that significant quantity is not the minimum amount to build a nuclear weapon. Okay? I should have said it up front, you know, questions at any time. If you got any questions? I'm pretty much on time. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Comments? Outrageous statements? Question in the back. Yes.
What is the IAEA's current interaction with Israel like?
Israel is a member of the IAEA. Israel does have some facilities which are free NPT safeguards. Israel participates, although they sometimes feel that they're abused in these things. I mean, when you go to, like I've been to the League of Arab States, and you know, all the groups feel that they have to make an obligatory statement about the evils of Israel. It gets a little boring, but that's the reality of doing business with the Middle East. So does that answer your question?
I was more so like, what is the notion of the fact that they have nuclear weapons, but it doesn't seem to be addressed?
The IAEA has no mechanism to address that. I mean, there are calls for at least ban on nuclear weapons. There are calls for various things, but the IAEA has no ability to address that. Nor does it, you know, you won't see E.G. Amano standing up at the General Conference. There's a General Conference every year in September. The IAEA is run by a board of governors, which has a standing membership, somewhat the way the Security Council is done, and a floating membership. The presidency rotates among all the members. You won't see Amano standing up at either the board of governors or at the General Assembly saying, you know, we've got to get on Israel about their nuclear weapons. U.S. policy is they either confirm or deny or acknowledge the fact that Israel has nuclear weapons. A few years ago, there was some Army publication that talked about Israel's nuclear weapons, and there's a big to-do about that. So basically, everybody kind of hides their head in the sand and looks the other way, including the IAEA. Yes.
How do you monitor?
Oh, by the way, let me point out one thing to you. One of my colleagues at Monterey, Avner Cohen, author of a book called Israel and the Bomb, is kind of the out of Israel expert on Israeli nuclear weapons program. Read anything that Avner writes on the subject. It's pretty good. Yes.
How do you monitor fuel cycles on a nuclear submarine?
Well, that's an issue that the IAEA is having to deal with now. Brazil has a nuclear submarine program. We think the Brazilians are going to build their nuclear submarine with LEU. Their assistance for the submarine, but not the reactor, is coming from France. France has converted from HEU for their aircraft carrier and all their submarines. They only burn LEU. They won't tell you exactly what the enrichment level is. Rumor has it it's about 7.5%, okay, which is comparable, a little bit above. Reactor fuel like that, if they have volcanium, is like 3 to 5%. But it's well, you know, well below the HEU threshold. India now has its own indigenous nuclear power submarine. India has leased 2 submarines, one from the original Soviet Union and another from the Russian Federation. And gee, the Charlie class submarine, or Vincent Victor, the second lease, their indigenous submarine looks just like it and has the same enrichment of fuel, which is about 40%. This has gotten very little attention. There's a concern among some people, myself included, about the potential race in nuclear submarines or nuclear power vessels. The Pakistanis aren't feeling like they ought to lease something from China. The Chinese have LEU powered submarines, as best anyone knows. But the concern is they may shift to HEU. There's a concern about, we would like to see, like with research reactors, the elimination of the use of highly enriched uranium as reactor fuel. The enrichment for US and UK submarine reactors was higher than what was used in weapons. Until we stopped making HEU back in the early 90s. Conversion was now the US and UK submarines on material that was removed from the weapons program. I want to read something about this. Google my name and look at NTI. We wrote a couple of grad students wrote a paper on this, or look at something. There are two papers, one by me and one by Alain Duclos, who's an ex-French admiral, engineer, and duty officer who ran their submarine program by the Federation of American Scientists. So the IAEA is still figuring out how they're going to deal with safeguarding material. You can take it out of safeguards, put it on a submarine, then when it comes off the submarine, it's supposed to go back into safeguards. It's a concept, but nobody knows exactly how to do it. It shouldn't be that hard to do because diverting it on a submarine would be pretty hard to do. And kind of silly thing to do. Other questions, comments, questions?
Sure. Could you comment about the kind of a cost-benefit analysis of tightening, potentially IAEA's ability to look more intensively at various nations versus, like the possibility of a nation withdrawing or, kind of that.
See, this is the thing. This is where politics comes in. We could have a discussion in this room. We could come up with the 10 most likely countries to have clandestine weapons programs. And we could say, okay, right now, boy, we just concentrate. We've got enough money. Actually, the budget of the IAEA is very low. It's about one nuclear fighter per year for everything. A lot of the IAEA lives on voluntary contributions by various countries. And there's some countries like Norway and Canada which contribute far in excess of what you would think, their fair share, we'll use it, taxing term would be. But going back to what you're talking about, well, what do you do about this? You can't say, all right, these are the 10 most dangerous countries. If you want to look at, there's a nuclear security ranking by NTI, which has had experts meet every couple of years, and they rank on things like corruption in the political system. Well, when the NTI ranking first came out, the first one was in 2011 or 2012, I was still with the IAEA. Oh my God, we had the ambassadors for all these countries which were ranked, in the 100 to 120 position or whatever it was, coming in and saying, how can they do this? How can they say that we're not, in the top 10? Why are we being picked on? The politics is you've got to come up with a system which treats everyone more or less equally. I mean, countries can, if you can catch somebody doing something, like most countries are not saying, oh, you're treating Iran unfairly. Most countries are like, okay, well, Iran was cheating, we caught them, they didn't declare facilities, blah, blah, blah. Okay, but don't get extreme about it. But this is where, I have a student who's working on a paper. She presented the first part of it last year, which was kind of MIIS that the policy people have about technical stuff in nuclear areas. The flip side of that, what she's working on now, is MIIS that technical people have about policy stuff. Like the technical people all think, if it's the right technical solution, obviously that's the right solution. Well, that may not fly politically. And you may have to whittle things down. When I was at the IAEA, one of the things I did was coordinate a lot of documents, and the way you produce documents in those days is still pretty much the same thing. You work up a document with a group of experts, maybe a dozen experts in the field. And then once you've got a draft document, you circulate it to the member states for comments. Then you have an open technical meeting, if it's an important enough document, where all the member states are invited. And since the agency is paying for people to come, you can usually limit that to 2 people from any member state. You pay for 2 people from the ones that on the list that you don't think can pay for themselves or wouldn't participate if you didn't pay for them, which is like 100 states. You get this assembly of people in Vienna to discuss the document in this open technical meeting, which can last, the longest one I remember is maybe 3 days, but could last a week or so. And if you're lucky, the people who come may have read the document on the airplane coming in. You almost hardly ever get the experts if they come from those countries. We invite them just because we know that the people who want to do political shopping trips to Vienna are not going to get it. And you have these big arguments, like, and they're political. Why are you saying this? Why are you? And you have the difference of dealing with all documents are written in English. You have people who are not native English speakers, etc. So at the end of this process, you finally get agreement, you finally get consensus. And consensus can be very difficult. So one quick story from that time. At the end of the document, most people got thrown into something. And somebody wanted to review the terms of definition in the back of the document. And there were like 50 defined terms. And this was literally the last afternoon of the last day of this thing. And for each document, you have a chairman. The chairman was a mechanic, big guy. And he's like, oh my God, what do we do? Let me try something. So after lunch, I said, okay, we're going to do what the US is an auction. We're going to have bids on this. I'm going to go through these 50 definitions and going once, going twice. You haven't raised an objection. We're going on. We went through all 50, but nobody raised their hand. And we got out of there in about a half hour. We were afraid we were going to have, this was the second technical meeting. Each one of them cost us about €500,000. And we were afraid we were going to have a third one to discuss definition. So the politics can be overriding. It can well override the technical side. You want to read a paper, which is very interesting, a paper written by Harry Van Tyne at Livermore and by a person from Sandia and a person from Los Alamos, whose names I can't remember right now. And it's on the SQ for uranium-233. And it's a technical analysis of why the SQ for uranium-233 is not accurate and should be changed. These are the leading weapons people from the 3 weapons laboratories in the United States. Was there ever any change made? No. Did the US ever propose a change based on that document? No. Politics. So that's the nexus between technology and politics. Other questions? I'm sorry, I'm taking more time. Okay, well, thank you very much. Oh.
I have a question. Plutoniums, do they include muscle 242 under that?
No, the definition, if you look at, and this picks up everything basically, if you look at the definition of special fission material, it says any plutonium containing plutonium-239. So you're going to have 239 in everything. So all stuff comes in at any quantity. In any quantity. But there are, you can look at the cross sections for plutonium, look at the average energies associated with nuclear weapons, look at Gladstone or something like that. And you can see that the cross sections are all in the same range. We're almost all the things. There are no bad things.
I have one other question. Well, so what would be the reality that would lead a state to agree to the 540 terms? And have you seen a flip where a state has decided to do that recently?
I don't know the second part of the question recently. It was a very popular thing at first, and there was some peer pressure among the states, like, let's do it. But then you have outliers who are not necessarily bad. But, for example, Argentina and Brazil, they have kind of their own agreement. And they're very reluctant to buy into outside agreements. And I'm forgetting right now what their agreement's called. Michael, maybe you remember there's an agreement.
Brazil and Argentina?
Brazil and Argentina.
Well, there's the Latin American Nuclear Free Zone.
Well, it's not the free zone. There's several free zones, but there's an agreement between Brazil and Argentina relating to.
Well, bilateral agreement.
Yeah, some sort of bilateral agreement. And they just say, look, don't bother us. we've got a handle. So you have those sorts of things.
Well, they are
But-
two of the countries that began to go down the nuclear weapons road and stopped.
Guadalajara?
No, I'm sorry, I just don't remember. I'll look it up and I'll email you and you can mention it next month.
Actually, I had a comment on your comment about Israel. Of course, there are now 4 states that have nuclear weapons that are not part of the NPT. Israel is one, India, Pakistan, and North Korea. Now, there's a distinction because North Korea had been a party to the NPT and then withdrew. But Israel, India, and Pakistan were never parties to the NPT. So there are questions here about what role, if any, IAEA safeguards have over those countries. And as Professor Moore mentioned, we have this added complication of the George W. Bush U.S.-India nuclear agreement, where we're providing nuclear energy assistance to a nuclear weapons state that's not party to the NPT. Of course, this is a broader issue because it has to do actually with the U.S. effort to contain China by strengthening U.S. ties with India. There's a whole geopolitical dimension to this, separate from the narrower non-proliferation issue. So life's complicated.
And China sold India nuclear submarines, even though India is not the NPT.
No, not China. The Soviet Union first leased,
Yeah.
I think it's a Charlie class submarine to the Indians.
Yeah.
At first lease, the Indians were able to operate the submarine, but there was a Russian crew that operated the reactor. The second lease, which is from the Russian Federation, and it's still ongoing, that particular submarine, the Indians crew the whole thing, including the engineering department. But the Soviets have a big presence there with their
The Russians.
responsible for maintenance and some other things.
So the first submarine, it was an Indian military submarine with a Soviet crew on it.
I mean,
They received very little attention in the United States.
China has never supplied anything of consequence to India. They're regional rivals. But at times, Russia plays a complicated game, which has actually increased security ties with China, is also providing assistance to India. And historically, they were very close when Nehru and so forth were heading the non-aligned movement during the Cold War.
Anybody know who has the largest submarine fleet in the world? The country? North Korea. The conventional boats. They don't have any nukes.
Who is the most powerful?
That's an interesting question. In the old days of the Soviet Union, the Soviets did a lot of stuff. And they had some very fast running boats. And they had boats that used anechoic coating. And literally, they had boats that were made of titanium where we didn't understand how to weld large sections of titanium. So, you know, the Soviets have, or the Russians now have a lot of technology in those areas, also aircraft development areas. Which you can make a case that the Soviets and the Russians have a communist, or have a capitalist system of developing weapons, where we have a communist system. By that I mean, you know, if the U.S. Air Force is going to buy a new fighter plane, and you know, McDonnell Douglas or pick a company, I don't know, McDonnell or Business Grumman or somebody is hurting and hasn't had a contract for a long time, it's probably going to go to them. In the Russian Federation, they have a fly-off between design bureaus, and the Red Air Force says, we like that one best. That's a capitalist system based on the merit of the design. Now, that's an exaggeration. You have to, they're subtleties among it.
Actually, going back one more time to your point, of course, the North Korean case among the 4 states is distinct because they are being punished for violating Security Council resolutions, and therefore you've got all the economic sanctions against them. There are no economic sanctions imposed through the UN against Israel, India, or Pakistan for acquiring nuclear weapons when they never were parties of the NPT in the first place. Now you have this emergent situation. We'll discuss this a little bit later, but you know, with the appointment of Pompeo, if he's confirmed as Secretary of State, who's been virulently anti-Iranian and anti-JCPOA in his prior public comments when he was a congressman, maybe pushing the president to withdraw from the JCPOA. This raises questions whether we're on the brink of the resumption of a major Iranian nuclear weapons program. And just over the weekend, there was an interview with Prince Salman of Saudi Arabia, who stipulated, and this has actually been stipulated before, but that if Iran were to acquire or move toward acquiring nuclear weapons, Saudi Arabia would unquestionably acquire nuclear weapons. Now, Iran is a member of the NPT, and so Saudi Arabia. So we could be on the brink of further new proliferation here. This year, calendar year 2018.
Yeah, if we are inclined, if we do break the JCPOA, who knows what's going to happen? It's just, nobody can predict. And Iranian participation in the IAEA is very interesting. When you invite the Iranians to a meeting, you have to do a name check on them, and you have to write a certification. You're not going to discuss anything in the meeting to be useful for them in a nuclear weapons program. But the Iranians who show up and participate are very good, top quality people. And they do a very good job. They understand things. They're cooperative. They work together with the other countries. Other than when you do something stupid like have a meeting and seat countries alphabetically and have Azerbaijan and Armenia sitting together, those groups will cooperate as long as you recognize and give them some recognition that they have differences between them. But they have a lot more in common than they have differences. And even the Arab states will work well with some of the Israelis on some things. They just don't like to publicize. One of the wonderful things about working with one of these agencies is you get to see a lot of this dynamic. One of the bad things is you have to get consensus if everybody agree, which can be extremely excruciatingly difficult. Yeah.
Have there been specific universities or just generally institutes that have produced more safeguard inspectors than others? Are there production houses for people who actually end up going into this line of work?
I don't know, but there are in the United States, Brookhaven National Laboratory has a group that is the pathway for Americans to get to the IAEA. They, if you want to go to the IAEA, you can respond to the IAEA job postings, but if you don't go through the Brookhaven system, you don't get support from. Let me back up a second. We have 3 ambassadors in Vienna. We have the bilateral ambassador, which is what most people think is the embassy and the ambassador. We have an ambassador called UNVI, which deals just with the agency and a little bit of other things. We have another ambassador who deals with other NGOs and things like UN AEC, United Nations Office of Drugs and in Vienna. So UNBI has these people from Brookhaven and talk to them, and they go over and they push for their people to get jobs. There's a big competition for jobs, and as an American, you're looked at askance to try and get a job at the IAEA. People are very political about, well, that job went to somebody from France, and they're leaving, so we've got to replace them with someone from France. You know, it's pretty political. Also, one of the things you don't realize if you get involved in, there are limits. Most people only get a 2-year contract to go to the agency. At max, most people can stay there for 7 years because they're very afraid of nepotism. They're very afraid. It's the only place I've ever worked in my life where you have to punch a time clock. It doesn't make any difference what level you're at. I was at P5, the highest level of professional, with diplomatic clearance. I had to punch a time clock every day. Because if you didn't, there's a lot of people who would never show up. I mean, there's a lot of differences about doing in an international setting. I should say a lot of people. There'll be some people who abuse the system.
Do you feel like the inspectors do that, the ones who actually go around? Is there?
When they're there in town, they have to punch time off. When they're out in the field, that's a different thing. And we all suffered during the time I was there from a scam with the inspectors. Some of the inspectors started pulling. They would schedule a meeting in a place where they wanted to go on vacation, a 1-day meeting, and then they would go on a month's vacation, and get the agency to pay for their round trip airfare. Travel there is very nice. If you're flying for more than 5 hours, you're flying business class. There's a lot of nice things about that, but the system is being abused. So things like that.
On the issue of the quality of the Iranian personnel, I taught at Harvard's Kennedy School in the 70s and 80s for over 10 years and had fairly close ties with the MIT nuclear engineering department. And at that time, so this is the period that straddles from before the Khomeini Revolution till after the Khomeini Revolution. I think they mentioned that at the peak, there were more than 50% of the nuclear engineering doctoral students at MIT were from Iran. And we know, because we keep track, that some of the key people in the Iranian program are MIT graduates. So they have absolutely world-class capability.
Woman in Liverpool, Virginia, who's deputy at CGSR. And
Eileen Virginia.
And she says, I know everybody in the Iranian nuclear weapons program. I went to school at MIT. That's an exaggeration, but not true. When I went to Berkeley here, one of our students, who I sat next to, our desks in the lab next to each other, was then the principal in the Libyan nuclear weapons program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
Who knew? I showed an example of his work.
Okay, well, please give Professor Moore a big hand. Thank you. We'll meet again on Wednesday, and we have another guest lecturer, Cheryl Garani from Sandia National Laboratory.